say hello. My name is Teresa Gauman, and I am a customer service librarian here at the Oshawa Public Libraries. And I'm very excited to be hosting this event and spending some time with you this afternoon. I would like to begin the event with a land acknowledgement. So the land we are sitting on today is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Oshawa is covered under the Williams Treaties, and as a settler on these lands, we are all treaty people. May we respectfully honor the knowledge and understanding of the Indigenous stewards of these ancestral lands and ensure that the voices of the First Peoples are represented in our collections, programs, and services. So since we are online today on Zoom, we may not all in fact be sitting on the same traditional lands. So please feel free to share in the chat what traditional lands or territory you are participating from, if it is different from where I am. And if you're unsure of what lands you are on, we've included a link in the chat to help you find out. And interestingly, there's also an app for your phone if you're ever traveling and want to know what traditional lands you happen to be on. So thank you for that. We will now move on to, I'm going to read a bio of our guest. So very excited. So Shilpi Somaya Gowda was born and raised in Toronto, Canada. In college, she spent a summer as a volunteer in an Indian orphanage, which seeded the idea for her first novel, The Secret Daughter, published in 2010. It was a New York Times and #1 international bestseller and was translated into over 30 languages. Secret Daughter was an Indie Next Great Read, a Target Book Club pick, a Chapters Indigo Heather's pick, and an Amnesty International Book Club pick. It was a finalist for the South African Boak Literary Prize and the Impact Dublin Literary Award. Her second novel, which by the way, the books are all nicely behind me here. Her second novel, The Golden Sun, was published in 2015 around the world and was a #1 international bestseller, a Target Book Club pick, a Costco buyer's pick, and was awarded the French Literary Prize Prix de l'Essine Folio. I'm sure I said that wrong and I apologize. Her third novel, The Shape of Family, was published in 2019. It was on the Canadian National Bestseller list for several months, then debuted at #2 on the LA Times bestseller list. More territories were slated for 2021 onward. Her novels have sold over 2 million copies worldwide. Shilpi holds an MBA from Stanford University and a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she was a Moorhead Kane Scholar. She has served on the advisory board of the Children's Defense Fund and is a patron of Child Haven International, the organization for which she volunteered in India. She lives in California with her husband and children. Please help me in welcoming Shilpi Somaya Gowda.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm happy to be with you and to be able to do a talk and a conversation without having a mask on and without any of you having to have a mask on. That's a small joy. I am beaming in today from San Diego, which is on the traditional land of the Kumeyaay tribe. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to be an author, and then a bit about each of my novels that Teresa mentioned. And then I think we're going to open it up for Q&A. So my story starts with my parents. They were immigrants who left India in search of opportunity, as so many people do. And they lived all over the world. Actually, they lived in Bahrain and Germany and London before they ended up landing in Toronto. They always thought they were going to go back one day. And then, one day became another year and another year. And like so many other people, Canada welcomed them and gave them opportunity. And so they ultimately decided to make a life there. Growing up in Toronto, I really learned to be comfortable in two different worlds at once. There was the world I had at home with my family, where the language and the food and the music and the community were all Indian. And then when I went to school, everything was Western and Canadian, and that navigating between two worlds would prove to be an important lesson in my life, and one that I think later showed up in my writing. So I put that lesson to work very early on. My father was an engineer. My mom was an accountant. So as you can imagine, numbers were very big in our house, and words, not so much. As a first generation immigrant family, my parents were supremely pragmatic. For most kids of my generation, there were four possible career choices. You could be a doctor, an engineer, a lawyer, or a failure. And although I had an aptitude for math and I had a logical brain, I also, from my very earliest years, loved to live in the world of stories. Reading was always my favorite activity. So I was that kid with the flashlight under the covers at night, begging my parents to take me to the library every weekend, where I would check out the maximum number of books. And so when I grew up, I ended up following in my parents' footsteps by leaving my home country in search of opportunity. For me, that came in the form of a scholarship to university in North Carolina. And I left thinking I was just off for a great adventure and I would come back one day. I studied economics with an emphasis on developing countries. And one of the great benefits of my scholarship was that it provided for 4 really interesting summer internships. One summer, I did an outward bound trip in the Colorado mountains. The next, I worked with the Minneapolis Police Department, riding along in cruisers at night. My third internship was on Wall Street with an investment bank. And then my final summer, I traveled throughout South Asia and Southeast Asia to conduct research for my senior economics thesis. And I visited people who worked with the Peace Corps and the Ford Foundation and the World Bank and all kinds of other organizations that were working in developing countries. And as part of that summer, I spent a month volunteering with a Canadian charity called Child Haven International that Teresa mentioned. They have operated orphanages throughout South Asia for many years. And I worked at their home in Hyderabad, which was a city in the south of India. So it was a part of the country that I had never been to, very different from where my family was from and where I had visited. I didn't speak the language. It was incredibly hot because it was, the south part of the country, and it was the height of summer, and the food was super spicy. And so it was a bit of a culture shock, even going to a country that, that my parents originally came from, because it's such a large and diverse country. But the most interesting thing for me was, before I went, I had expected an orphanage to be a sad place. It sounds like it's going to be a sort of a sad and depressing spot, but I found it to be quite the opposite. The children there were just full of joy and life. And we found ways of communicating, even though we couldn't speak the same language. And I grew really attached to those kids. And I thought about them many times after that summer, after I left. So I went back to university, finished my last year, got my degree, graduated after having many of those great adventures that I had sought. And that, in my original plan, I should have come back to Canada then and pursued my career in life. But in that funny way of life, I ended up staying in the US to pursue my graduate education and then my business career. I met my husband, got married, and started a family. And during that time, I moved to the West Coast and was living in San Francisco. And all those years when I was studying and working in the realm of business, I still nurtured my love of the story. So I was a very avid reader. I was in 2 book clubs, and I found myself sort of writing just random bits and pieces whenever I could. I didn't have any plan or goal, but I was just kind of filing away ideas for stories and characters. So when I went on a business trip and I found myself on a plane or in a restaurant by myself, I would jot down things on cocktail napkins. And so I think in the back of my mind, I always thought about writing a novel. But I thought about it in the same way that, some people say, like, one day I'm going to run a marathon, or one day I'm going to, learn to play the guitar. I sort of had this vague dream rather than a plan. But I figured out that, maybe after I retired from my business career and my kids were grown and gone, it might be like a retirement hobby, like taking up watercolor or something like that. So in 2005, I was living in San Francisco, where I had been for a decade after business school. And I had this wonderful full life with my husband. We had our first baby. I had a part-time career that I loved and dear friends. And I remember one January when we were I was with my book club and we were talking about our plans and goals for the year. And I remember saying to them, my life is perfect right now. I don't want anything to change, which of course is a foolish thing to say. Soon thereafter, my husband came home one day from work and said, honey, I've got the job opportunity of a lifetime, and it's in Dallas. And the only thing I knew about Dallas was the TV show my parents watched growing up, which some of you may remember. And it did not make me want to move there. I was really sad at the prospect of leaving San Francisco and, a city and a life that I loved. But the thing about a full and wonderful life is it doesn't leave space for anything new. And so we decided it was the right thing for our family to make this move. It was supposed to be temporary, a couple years. So after arriving in Dallas, I suddenly had a lot of open space in my life. And I decided, okay, maybe I should try to finally write that novel that I keep thinking about in the back of my mind. But the thing is, I did not know the first thing about writing, certainly not writing a novel. I had no business even attempting that. I hadn't taken an English class since high school, and I hadn't written anything more than a bullet point on a PowerPoint slide in over 10 years. And I ended up having some great help and some good fortune. I signed up to take creative writing classes at the university in my new hometown. And the first class I took was called Novel One. It was, the first in a series. And I went to the first night of this first class and I thought, this is great. I have my sharpened pencils. I'm going to learn how to write a novel. And the instructor said, I want you to write the climax scene of your novel as your homework for the first week. And I kind of looked around at everybody in the room. I thought I'd missed like a whole other class or something because I didn't have a novel. And I didn't even really have a full idea for a novel. The only thing I had was this, tiny little kernel of an idea. And that kernel had come from that summer I had spent at the orphanage in India. In the years since then, I had often thought of the kids that I'd met. But in my mind, they were sort of frozen in age. They were, 3 and 5 and 7 years old, the way I remembered them. And at some point, I realized that 15 years had passed since then, and they were older. And I wondered what had happened to them. And I wondered particularly about the girls in a country like India, where there is such a great gender imbalance in the birth rate. I think most people know now that imbalance is due to, multiple cultural factors. But at the time, this was probably, 20 years ago, that information wasn't sort of as widely known. But I started looking into it, and I found a UN estimate that 100 million girls and women are missing from the population due to infanticide and neglect in countries like India and China and parts of Eastern Europe. And the economist in me could not let go of that number and all the potential that it represented. Think about that for a moment. That's 100 million daughters, sisters, wives, 100 million teachers, doctors, engineers, artists, perhaps a brilliant scientist or a great judge or a prime minister. So I knew I wanted to write a story about one of those girls having a chance at a different life. And I was intrigued by the idea of the dual worlds of this little girl in my mind, the one she was born into and the one she ends up living out. So armed with only that, small, vague concept, I went home and dutifully wrote the climax scene of the novel I had yet to conceive of. And that was how Secret Daughter was born. It is the story of a baby girl born in an Indian village where sons are favored. Her mother gives her a chance at life by taking her to an orphanage in Bombay, and she's adopted by a couple in California. The novel traces the next 20 years in the parallel lives of these two families, told through the eyes of the two mothers and the daughter they share. After Secret Daughter was published in, I think it was 30 or so countries around the world, I began to hear from people in places as different as Norway and South Africa and Israel. And I began to understand that what resonated was that at its heart, this was a story about family, the struggles and challenges that all families go through in their marriages, with their children, and as they make their way in the world. And right after I handed in the final draft of Secret Daughter, which was about a year before it was published, I got my first inspiration for my next novel. And again, it was just, tiny little flash of an idea. My ideas usually come when I envision a particular character in a tough situation. And then I try to build from there. So for my second novel, that first kernel was the image of a boy on the brink of adolescence, witnessing his father play the important role of being the arbiter of the community's disputes. A boy who doesn't quite understand the gravity of what's happening yet. In India, there is a long tradition of settling disputes between individuals and families within a community. The original form was an assembly of 5 respected elders used in rural areas before formal judicial systems were established. It was called a panchayat, which punch means 5 and ayat means assembly. So I named the fictional village in my novel Punchnagar, which means village of 5. And that custom has endured in less formal ways in many communities, even though there are judicial systems and police in all of these rural areas now. So I witnessed that same practice of navigating disputes in my family and in other families, usually by an elder male. As a child, I was not often privy to those conversations. When they happened, I was usually shooed out of the room or sent out on a bike ride. So my imagination took over, which is, kind of a dangerous thing when you're a creative young child. Who likes to read, your imagination can go in a lot of directions. So I tried to imagine what was being said and decided behind those closed doors. And as I grew older, I heard many more stories about lives that were changed in this way. My mother told me the story of an aunt of hers in the village who was freed from an abusive marriage by the ruling of the panchayat. She had no other way of getting out of this abusive marriage. And she ended up coming and living with my mother's family in Bombay, and eventually trained to become a nurse, and had a whole other, season of her life that she wouldn't have otherwise had. And I was just really intrigued by this whole idea, especially as I became an adult and I realized that grown-ups don't always have the answers. And in fact, there's often no clear answer to be had. These are all, difficult choices and trade-offs. One of the things I found really interesting about this was the community aspect. Not all disputes obviously can be settled happily for all the parties, but afterwards, these people have to go back to living together right next to each other in the same community, which is so different from, the anonymous transactional way we administer justice in our society, with judges and juries who are not permitted, nobody's permitted to know each other or have any pre-existing relationships. So I began to kind of consider how the responsibility of doing that, of making those choices, would weigh on an individual, and how different people might react to, to being placed in that role of being the arbiter. And I wanted to explore a character who I thought it would be interesting to explore, someone who was kind of thrust into the role of making decisions before he felt equipped to do so, and perhaps in conflict with his own desires and ambitions. And I thought it would be really interesting if that character had chosen to pursue a career in medicine, where the stakes are often life and death. So then in all parts of his life, he would be grappling with making choices in the lives of others, with all of the moral and ethical questions involved. So I wove all of those ideas together. They kind of went into my mental frying pan and simmered for quite some time before they kind of came together into a narrative. And after many incarnations in drafts over 5 years, that story became The Golden Sun, which was my second novel. It's the story of two childhood friends in an Indian village, Anil, who's the golden son of his family, and a girl named Lena. They start out as the closest of friends, and then their lives diverge for many years, and their paths cross again as adults when everything is much more complicated and the stakes are higher. So the process of writing that novel was really challenging for me, because I had to work hard to find the best way to tell the story I wanted to tell. It started as a series of short stories and then became a novel. The point of view changed from first person to third person, then back to first person. And I had one narrator and then went all the way up to 6, and then back to 4. So pretty much everything that could change changed. I think I started over from the blank page twice. So I probably had about 1,000 pages I threw out. and I now in retrospect, I think I was just really stubborn with wanting to find a way to, to tell the story I wanted to tell. Maybe it would have been wiser to let that one sit in a drawer and move on. But I'm proud of the story I ended up writing. And that is the one that won a literary award in France a couple years ago. And when I started writing that novel, we were still living in Dallas, which we had actually come to love as our new home. And then my husband got another job opportunity of a lifetime. Yes, if you're keeping track, that is 2 opportunities of a lifetime in one lifetime. And this time it was in San Diego. So I was pretty happy now that I had a career that was portable. And we have been here for about 12 years now. So that brings us to my current book, The Shape of Family, or my most recent book, I should say. The Shape of Family is about a contemporary multicultural family who suffer a tragedy that leave them drifting in different directions. The main characters are the father, Keith, who is an all-American investment banker, the mother, Jaya, who is an Indian woman from a diplomatic family who grew up all over the world, their daughter, Karina, a headstrong, ambitious teenager, and their son, Prem, a fun-loving and mischievous 7-year-old. And the story follows each member of the family over a period of 8 years, but it focuses on Karina, the adolescent girl. She, excuse me, struggles through her teenage years, and she goes off to university and falls in love and gets her heart broken, and then is left seeking for a place to belong. The original title of that book was The Seekers, and it's really because everybody in the book is seeking a sense of identity and belonging. And so those are kind of the underlying themes. You know, how is our identity shaped? How do we define it for ourselves? Everyone in the novel is looking for that. The members of the family, the members of Karina's community, where she ends up, you know, trying to find a home. And then the book, at the 11th hour, we decided to rename it The Shape of Family. And now I think it really encapsulates the book perfectly, because it's really about the idea of family as an ecosystem where each person has a multifaceted relationship, and their interplay between all the family members is complicated. It's always shifting and evolving and flexing to one another. Even the idea of what constitutes a family changes. You know, we start with the family you're born into. That can shift if you choose a mate. It can extend to the family you create together. And then it can occasionally harken back to the family into which you were born. So family as kind of a fully interdependent, multidimensional creation affects most of us more than anything else will in our lives, and often in unseen ways. So this novel explores that idea. Ultimately, it's a story of reckoning and reconciliation between and within each family member. There's some these themes of identity and belonging and family kind of echo my previous books, but I also think The Shape of Family is probably the most different in a few ways. It's a much more contemporary story, and so it touches on more recent events and issues like the financial crisis, 9/11, the Me Too movement, climate change, things like that are, you know, more part of our current dialogue. And it explores the very current issue of what it's like to grow up as an adolescent in today's world, with intolerance on the rise and mass shootings a fact of life. As a society, even before the pandemic, this book, The Shape of Family, was published in the Canada in October 2019, and was published in the US on the day the world shut down, March 17th, 2020. So even before the pandemic, we were seeing increased rates of depression and anxiety across the spectrum amongst young people. Universities are overwhelmed for needs for counseling. And obviously that's only become more acute since in the past couple of years. So this book kind of explores how this world unfolds in one individual, and where it can lead. So that's kind of a recap of me and how I became an author, and a little bit about each of my books. And I would love to open it up if this is a good time to questions that you may have.
That's perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. Just quickly, if you have questions, you can use the reactions feature and put your hand up, and Jen or myself will be able to see it and then call on you. I'll quickly ask, because one of the questions that I had was about kind of the inspiration, and you talked about the inspiration for two of them, but the last one, where did that particular inspiration come from?
Um, so the shape of family is probably in some ways the most close, the inspiration comes most closely from a personal life event of mine. So I had a friend in college who moved to California after college, and she was this bright shining star. She had like an amazing career ahead of her. She was a Nashville born leader. People loved her. She had a really bright future, and we ended up learning that she had basically we got the news that she had been killed in a murder suicide and had been suspected to be living with a cult. And so, in addition to the personal devastation, after the dust settled on that news, we all found ourselves wondering, like, how could this happen? How could somebody who was smart, independent, talented, strong wind up with a group of people who ended up being, very destructive? And, so I have always sort of wanted to explore that idea of how people join groups that ultimately are, that are destructive and autocratic in that way, particularly because, my personal knowledge was that it didn't fit in with sort of the cliches we hear about people needing to be weak or vulnerable or like not connected to their families. My friend was none of those things. And so I really wanted to explore the idea of how, a smart, talented young person could end up in in this kind of scenario. And so I did a lot of research on cults. I interviewed a bunch of experts. I actually had to think very hard before I wanted to write this book, because now, as my third novel, I knew I was going to have to live with this idea in my head every day for several years. I was going to have to go deep into the content. And I wasn't sure I wanted to live in that dark place, even in my working part of my mind. But, I thought about the idea and researched it for probably a year and a half before I realized I couldn't not do it. I was driven to do it. And so, because I write fiction, I like to write different endings for scenarios that I wish that were different. So I wrote the story of a girl who joins this kind of a group, and I give the explanation of how she was vulnerable to joining. But I knew she was going to have to get out. It could not end the way my friend's story ended. So I wrote an alternate ending, where she ends up escaping and, having some hope for recovery at the end. So that was kind of the inspiration for it.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that's a very personal story. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Jen did put in the chat also, yeah, if you have questions, you can just put them in the chat. But I see Marcy has a hand up. So yeah, Marcy, unmute yourself and jump in.
Thank you. I just completely enjoyed your presentation. I'm getting so much energy from your talk, and a big thank you, of course, to the library as well. So I've read The Secret Daughter, loved it. Just really appreciate the fact that you as an author, you address very difficult situations with so much compassion and authenticity. So for example, I listened to an interview from a gentleman that was living in Afghanistan, And it was absolutely heartbreaking. He was actually explaining, why he had to sell his 5-year-old daughter. And he was explaining that it was for the rest of the family. And when I read Secret Garden, I feel like you do a really good job of showcasing like impossible choices that families have to make, but you do it with so much compassion that it's not judgy and not judgmental, which I think is really helpful for the world, to be honest. And I just wondered sort of what reserves you use to be able to do that.
Thank you. That's a wonderful comment. I'm glad that that's something that you notice and appreciate. One of the interesting challenges of writing fiction is, in order to do it convincingly, I learned you have to be able to empathize with your character, all your characters, even the ones that do things that are despicable. And so it's a good exercise in being human, actually, to sometimes I will write a character. So for example, in Secret Daughter, I wrote the character of Jasu, who was the father at the beginning of the story, who's responsible for doing terrible things to a baby girl. And when I read the drafts through, he struck me as being one-dimensional. And I just set myself the challenge of saying, let me back up a moment. When I was at the orphanage, most of those kids were not orphans. They were surrendered. And when I became a mother, many years afterwards, 15 years later, I found myself wondering about those mothers that gave up their kid, because I knew that it could not have been out of, hatred. It had to be out of desperation. And so that was the first sort of character in the story that I tried to build. There's a narrative around mothers and how they are supposed to behave and what it means if they don't behave in predictable ways. And so it was a challenge for me to build a character who could, be forced to do the unthinkable, what we call unthinkable, but really is a pragmatic choice for, people who are in different circumstances. So that was my first exercise in trying to, create empathy. And it was a little more accessible to me because I was a mother and I had all these maternal fears and instincts, and all I had to do is like blow them up really big. And then I could put myself in Kavita's shoes. And then I set myself the challenge of trying to do it for the father, who's like a little less accessible and his choices are a little less understandable. But I tried to imagine, just like I did with the birth mother, what might have happened to make somebody do this or to think this way, or how might he be haunted by those decisions after the fact, or how might he have been pressured into it? What are all the forces, economic, family, cultural, playing on people? I don't believe that people are inherently bad. I feel that we all have the capacity for good and bad within us, and circumstances often, influence, which of those petals you press on. And so then it was a challenge for me to do that for Jesu. And I feel like it was a small thing. It was only a few scenes I added in the final drafts of the book, but I feel like it made it a lot more layered and nuanced, because there was no villain and hero. There are no villains and heroes in that book. Everybody does good and bad things, which I believe is pretty reflective of humanity. So now I'm writing my 4th novel now. I have a family. It's sort of multiple families. And there's one family that I don't have enough empathy for yet. And I can tell. And I know I just keep writing in the margins. I got to come back to this. I have to put myself in these people's shoes and try to explain why they can, do and say these things that might not look great on the surface. So it's a nice addition to, sort of being a citizen of the world, is going through the exercise of empathizing with people who are different, or who make different choices. And so it's, that's one of the reasons I read. And it's one of the things I think is most powerful about fiction, is it can put you in somebody else's shoes. You can't travel everywhere, you can't know everyone, but you can have more of the world more perspectives open up to you through reading. And so that's sort of what I try to endeavor to do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I don't see anyone's hand or any questions in the chat right now, but you touched on your writing of the next book. So just wondering, that was one of my questions was, are you working on anything currently? And what can you share, if anything, about that work, aside from there's the one family that needs a little bit more attention?
Yeah. Yeah, so I am writing, it's a pretty contemporary kind of, I would say, current social issues type novel, and it takes place in Southern California, present day, and it focuses really on the idea of socioeconomic class clashing with culture, and probably in a fairly explicit way deals with like, what is the definition of the American dream? I'm using the word American because just the generic, sense. What is the idea of the American dream? And when immigrants come here from different countries, what burdens and headwinds are they facing depending on where they come from? Because all immigrants are not the same, and all countries and backgrounds are not the same. So that's sort of the loose. It's not far enough along for me to give it a better definition than that, but that's sort of the backdrop of the idea. Awesome. I see a question in the chat, actually.
Yep. Now we've got a couple, actually.
Okay. What was the driving force for you to go from writing class to actually publishing your books? So I took a series, remember the novel one class? I took like that whole series of classes and ended up having a finished manuscript at the end of it. And I was, that writing program had an opportunity for students to submit their manuscripts. And if we were chosen, we would get to fly to New York and sit down with professionals in the publishing industry who would read a sample of our work and give us professional feedback. So I did that, and through that process, I ended up meeting an agent, a literary agent, who offered to represent me. There were a handful, actually, and I remember interviewing them all. And one of them said, "I don't think your book is done yet." And I said, "I agree." And so I went with her, even though the other ones thought it was done and ready to publish. I had sort of reached the limits of my own ability, like with no I didn't have a master's in fine arts, and I hadn't had any real training. And so I just kind of knew like I was out of skill, but I needed to make it better. And so that's a be careful what you wish for scenario, because my agent made me revise it for another year and a half before she thought it was ready. But obviously she was right in the end, because that book was Secret Daughter. So then she took it out to publishers, and, we found a publisher from that. But it was, it was also kind of like that, just harebrained, like, well, I might as well try. Like, I didn't know what I didn't know, which is good, because had I known the odds, how badly the odds were stacked against me to do any of those things, find an agent or get a publisher or any of it, I probably would have, like, the very pragmatic side of me would have been like, I'm going back to my consulting business. Like, this is crazy. I wrote the novel. It can sit in a drawer, but, luckily my naivete was helpful.
Awesome. Another question from Jennifer Singh. Approximately how long does it take you to complete a novel? And who are some authors that you like to read?
It varies quite a bit. So I would say, and then there's a very long process of just being in the publishing gauntlet, even after a book is finished, which is like, for me, that ends up being like a year to 2 years of, like, after a book is finished, it takes a year or two for it to come out. But I would say the writing process, first drafts can be pretty quick for me, like 6 to 12 months. But by the time I've gone through all the rewriting and revisions, and then I'm getting outside feedback and revising again, that's usually, I don't know, 2 to 5 years, probably. Like the Golden Sun was by far the longest, and that was 5 years. The current one I'm working on is the fastest. And, you know, I think I've been working on it for less than a year. And it's already in its 6th draft, probably. So it kind of depends on the story and how many people are involved.
That makes sense. And favorite author, or who do you like to read? What authors do you like to read?
Oh gosh, I have
I
so many.
know.
I have so many favorite authors. I read a lot of new authors too, just to sort of stay current, and like I like to be able to endorse debut authors when they're, you know, coming out with their first books, because that was such a big deal for me when a couple people did that for me. So I like to always do that for other authors. But I love Jhumpa Lahiri. She's one of my all-time favorites. Rohingya Mystery. I like Ann Patchett, Michael Cunningham. Those are a few. Yeah, I like, you know, I think I've become very forgiving of authors who write multiple books now that I know how hard it is you cannot write at this, you know, the same level of commercial success for each book. Sometimes you just have to let an author follow their creative meandering path, and that means not every book, you're not going to love every book. Like Michael Cunningham, I probably love half of his books, but he's written a lot of books, you know. So those are the authors I give wide berth to. Like I'll buy whatever they publish, and if I don't love it, it's fine. It'll just still sit on the shelf next to the ones I do love.
Awesome. Another comment from another Jen. I loved Secret Daughter and look forward to reading more. Oh, sorry, my screen moved. I look forward to reading more. I'm wondering if you ever stayed connected to anyone from the orphanage, went back to India, or were able to track down anyone from the orphanage.
Yeah, I have, you know, after I wrote Secret Daughter, I reconnected with Child Haven, the folks at Child Haven. I'd never fallen out of touch with them. You know, I was always on their mailing list and that kind of thing, but I told them, you know, about the book and the inspiration for the book. And there's, in fact, if you look on my website, under the Secret Daughter tab, there's an essay called Behind the Book. And it's a story of, you know, the little girl at the orphanage that I became super connected to. And, you know, she was sort of the sort of individual level inspiration for the book. So, in the years since then, I've done a lot of work with Child Haven. I've, you know, spoken at several of their fundraising dinners across Canada and helped them raise money, and have learned that little girl, whose name is Yashoda, obviously grew up. She's not a little girl anymore. She was 3 when I was 20. So she's, you know, 30 now. She grew up, went to became a nurse. I think was in, you know, was married for a time, but ultimately came back to the orphanage and now is the nurse for the same orphanage. She and her sister work together at the orphanage, and has had, you know, a good life. So that's been real. But I haven't been back. I've been back to India many times, but as I mentioned, that's a totally different part of India. And now that I'm married, my husband is from yet another part of India. So when we go back, we already cannot go to all the places our family is. So I've never made it back to Hyderabad to visit that specific orphanage, but I am in pretty good touch with the, you know, the folks that run it.
Oh, wow. What a lovely, touching
Yeah.
story and follow-up. That's amazing. And yeah, Jennifer says, thank you. I thoroughly enjoy your books and continue to share them with my friends. As do I. I've said earlier, I've been walking around being like, have you read this? Have you read this? So good.
Thank you.
Yeah, just quickly before we go, we are getting closer to the time, but just kind of a fun question. Does writing energize or exhaust you? And then feel free to explain, or both, right? It can probably do both at times, but yeah, what are your thoughts?
I would say it mostly energizes me. The only times when it has felt exhausting is when I have to do a set of revisions under deadline. I find revisions harder than writing. Writing like a first draft or even editing my own work is always, if I can carve out enough time for it, is always sort of energizing and exciting. And it gets like all my cylinders spinning, or whatever the right analogy is. But yeah, sometimes if I'm under like a pressured deadline and I have to rewrite like a certain number of pages and, troubleshoot and problem solve a whole bunch of things that I just can't figure out how to do, and I have to do it under time pressure, then it can become exhausting. But that's, probably less than 10% of the time I spend writing falls in that category. So yeah, it's energizing.
Awesome. That's a great answer. Eva is asking, out of the novels you have written, this is one of my favorite questions. I'd love to ask it too. Which one is your favorite? Because we've often heard that it's like picking a favorite child. But my argument there is sometimes your favorite child
Sometimes you have a favorite child.
depends on the day, right? Or the minute. It may change, but it does happen.
Usually the one I'm working on, because it's the one that I'm, I have the most energy for. Like Secret Daughter just like my oldest child will always be, my oldest child is the one that made me a mother, and Secret Daughter is the book that made me an author. So I have like a very fond spot in my heart for that. Golden Son is the one I think I'm probably proudest of, because I worked the hardest on it. Again, maybe unwisely, but I'm happy with the barreling through that I did on that book. And The Shape of Family, I think, is a little bit it's a little bit different from my previous novels. So, maybe it sort of represents my growth and my ability to branch out and to not sort of play in the same sandbox time after time, which is, I feel like that would be a bit of a cop out for me creatively, to just sort of write a different version of the same book over and over. So, for different reasons, I think, because they've happened at different times in my career, I think I'm not answering your question, but I guess I would probably say my current one, because it's the one that's, occupying my mind.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common answer too from a lot of authors. So, because it's the one that's in your head right at this time.
Right.
So I had noticed, I've read Secret Daughter and I'm reading The Golden Son. I haven't read the third one yet, but I had noticed that there was doctors. Doctors seem to be, and as I said, I haven't read the third one, so I don't know if there's doctors in there. But so I was just wondering, what's the significance of the doctors coming into play in so far 2 of the novels?
Yeah. So yes, the early wave of immigrants to the US and Canada, because of the way the immigration laws were rewritten and finally opened up in the late 60s, was largely, that immigration wave was largely doctors, some engineers, but largely doctors. And so when I was writing the story of people who were coming over during that time, that is where they would largely have fallen. So, when I wrote my first novel, I didn't think I was ever going to write another novel. So I just sort of wrote the thing that made most sense to me. And then with The Golden Son, I thought it would be really intriguing to write about a doctor, given the whole idea I was trying to set up of, somebody who was forced to make big life decisions. And there was a writer, in my writers group, there was a doctor, full-time doctor in my writers group. And I was sharing the idea with them, and she goes, that's going to be super hard to write, right? Like all the medical stuff, like you can't really do that. And I think when she said, you can't really do that, again, here's my stubbornness. I was like, oh yes, I can. I'm going to figure it out. And so I ended up having to do so much research for that book, because it basically follows a first year medical intern through his 3 years of residency. And yeah, by the end of it, I was like, yeah, I probably shouldn't have bitten this off. But, and I was so done with the medical stuff by then that there are no doctors in my third and fourth novel. Have no fear.
It wasn't a bad thing. It's just something
No,
that I
I
had
know.
noticed.
Yeah.
So on that note, I just want to say thank you so much, Shilpi. This was amazing. You are a fantastic author. And I feel like a lot of us probably would agree. We could listen to you talk all day about your life. And I mean, I'm still interested in those 4 excursions that you did in school where you did, like, you know, you did some really cool things aside from the orphanage. So I feel like we could listen to you for probably a lot more hours, but unfortunately we are running out of time. So thank you to everyone who tuned in as well. And just folks are saying, thank you so much. This was great. And thank you. Thank you. So thank you. This was awesome.
Thank you,
I truly enjoyed it.
guys.
And I wish you all a wonderful day and rest of your week. Stay safe. And thank you. And we'll see you at the next program.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.